How are you, everyone? This is MJ Fan TV. Stop scrolling, because today's Michael Jackson update is bigger than you think. We bring you the latest MJ news, biopic updates, box office shockers, and fan reactions from around the world. If you're a true Michael Jackson fan, you don't want to miss this. Hit like, subscribe, and let's jump straight into it.
It is opening weekend, April 2026. You are standing outside a movie theater at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the line is already wrapping around the block. Adults in their 40s are wearing Thriller jackets. Teenagers who weren't even alive when Michael Jackson died are humming Billie Jean while they wait for their tickets. And somewhere in Hollywood, in a wood-paneled room where studio executives have spent years biting their nails, somebody is looking at a number on a screen that they genuinely never expected to see. $217 million in a single weekend. Not for a Marvel movie. Not for a sequel to a franchise that has been running for 2 decades. For a biographical drama about a man who died in 2009. For a story that almost didn't make it to theaters at all. That was delayed not once, but twice. That had its entire third act ripped out and rewritten from scratch because of a legal discovery so explosive it sent the production into a full-scale crisis. For a film that Michael Jackson's own daughter called a Hollywood fantasy packed with, quote, full-blown lies. And yet, here we are. Michael, the Lionsgate biopic directed by Antoine Fuqua and starring the king of pop's actual nephew, Jaafar Jackson, has just shattered the all-time domestic opening record for any biopic in cinema history. It has beaten Oppenheimer. It has left Bohemian Rhapsody in the dust. And it is sprinting toward $1 billion at the global box office. A number so astronomical that even the people who made the film are still catching their breath. But how did we get here? And what is the real story behind this movie? The lawsuits, the family feuds, the legal bombshell that nearly destroyed the whole production, and the incredible performance at the center of it all. Buckle up, because this one is something else entirely. Welcome back to the channel. If you have been even remotely paying attention to entertainment news in the spring of 2026, you have heard about Michael. You have seen the clips. You have seen Jaafar Jackson transforming into his uncle in a way that had audiences gasping and grandmother Katherine Jackson crying actual tears. You have probably seen the Rotten Tomatoes split, a jaw-dropping 33% from critics and a 97% from audiences. That reignited one of the biggest debates in modern Hollywood about who gets to decide what a movie is worth. But here's the thing. Most of what you have heard about this film barely scratches the surface. Because the story of how Michael came to exist, how it almost didn't, how a single legal clause buried in a decades-old settlement agreement forced filmmakers to throw away their entire ending and start over at a cost of $15 million, how the Jackson family fractured publicly over the production, and how the movie became one of the most culturally significant entertainment events of the decade. That story is far more dramatic than anything that made it onto the screen. Today, we're going all the way in. We are going to take you through the complete journey of this film. From the very beginning, when producer Graham King first walked into a room with the Jackson estate and pitched a vision, all the way to the present moment, where Michael is closing in on Bohemian Rhapsody's all-time music biopic record and seems poised to become the highest-grossing music film in history. We will talk about the behind-the-scenes chaos that almost sank the production entirely. We will talk about Paris Jackson's explosive social media posts and how they sent shockwaves through the family. We will get into the audience versus critics war, which has become one of the most talked-about cultural flashpoints of the year. We will explore what this movie means for Michael Jackson's legacy, for the future of music biopics, and for the estate that has been protecting and profiting from his name for 17 years since his death. And we will get into something that a lot of people are only now starting to whisper about, what happens next. Because Michael ends with 3 words that might be the most promising words in Hollywood right now. The story continues. There's so much to get through. So let's start at the very beginning. To understand just how shocking the opening weekend of Michael truly was, you need to understand where expectations were just 6 weeks before the film arrived in theaters. In mid-March of 2026, the most bullish box office tracking services were projecting the film would open somewhere between $80 and $90 million domestically. That was already considered an extraordinary number for a biographical drama, a figure that would have beaten every biopic opening in history by a significant margin. The previous record holder was Oppenheimer, which had debuted to $80 million domestically in July of 2023. Before that was straight Outta Compton at $60 million in 2015. Bohemian Rhapsody, the Queen biopic that went on to become the highest-grossing music biopic of all time, had opened to just $51 million. So projections of 80 to 90 million were already considered remarkable. Even the studio, Lionsgate, was privately messaging that they would be thrilled with those numbers. Then something happened that nobody in tracking had fully anticipated. Presale tickets began moving in a way that industry veterans described as unprecedented for a non-franchise film. The IMAX and premium large format screenings that Lionsgate had scheduled for Wednesday, April 22nd, 2 full days before the official release, sold out in hours. By Thursday, it was clear the opening day was going to be enormous. And on Friday, April 24th, when the general release hit 4,000 screens, the film earned $39.5 million in a single day. That one Friday was already nearly as much as Bohemian Rhapsody had made in its entire opening weekend. By Sunday night, the weekend total stood at $97.2 million domestically. Internationally, it added another $121.6 million. The global debut, $218.8 million. The biggest opening weekend in the history of music biopics. The biggest opening in the history of any biopic, full stop. A number that had beaten projections by nearly $30 million and left the entire Hollywood industry scrambling to recalibrate everything it thought it understood about the commercial potential of biographical films. Graham King, who had produced Bohemian Rhapsody and understood the music biopic market better than almost anyone alive, reportedly told colleagues he was stunned. Antoine Fuqua, the director, the man who made Training Day, The Equalizer, Olympus Has Fallen, sat in a theater that opening weekend and watched crowds who had come to simply be in the presence of Michael Jackson's music react the way only fans of the very greatest artists react. With tears, with standing ovations, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. And Jaafar Jackson, 29 years old, the son of Jermaine Jackson, a young man who had essentially grown up invisible to the public despite his famous surname, who had trained obsessively for years for a role that would define him forever. He sat somewhere and let it wash over him that the world had just accepted him as his uncle, that they had not just accepted him, but embraced him. That 97% of the audience that had seen this film had given it a positive score. But here's what made the opening truly extraordinary, and what separated it from other massive blockbusters. The audience showing up for Michael was not the typical opening weekend crowd of hardcore fans who had already bought their tickets months in advance. According to audience demographic surveys conducted by Lionsgate and third-party tracking services, a significant portion of the opening weekend crowd was made up of people who had either not planned to see the film until word of mouth reached them, or had been genuinely ambivalent about it and decided to go based on what they were hearing from friends and family. This was not just a film for diehard MJ fans. This was a film that was pulling in older audiences, families, people who had grown up with Michael Jackson's music, and even younger viewers for whom the king of pop was a legendary figure they knew from the cultural air rather than from personal memory. The movie was also benefiting from something that few recent blockbusters had managed to harness, the pure emotional power of the music. Because Michael had the rights to all of Jackson's music, an advantage that previous, unauthorized biopics had never possessed, it could actually use Thriller, Billie Jean, Beat It, Man in the Mirror, the whole catalog, performed live on screen by Jaafar Jackson in sequences that audience members described as genuinely electric. That access to the music was not just a narrative tool. It was a commercial weapon, and it worked. Within days of the opening weekend, the data told a story that went even beyond the box office numbers. According to Billboard, Jackson's solo catalog registered a career-best 137.5 million official on-demand streams in the United States during the week of April 24th through April 30th. That was up 146% from his previous career high. Thriller shot back up to number 7 on the Billboard 200. A version of the album's title track, included on the Michael Songs from the Motion Picture soundtrack, was generating its own streaming numbers independently. Michael Jackson had been gone for 17 years, and in the spring of 2026, he was everywhere again. But to understand how this moment was created and nearly destroyed, you have to go back to where it all started. The origin story of Michael begins, in a certain sense, not with the film itself, but with another film. In 2019, HBO released Leaving Neverland, the two-part documentary directed by Dan Reed, in which Wade Robson and James Safechuck spoke at length about allegations that Michael Jackson had sexually abused them as children. The documentary was a cultural earthquake. Radio stations pulled Jackson's music. Streaming services briefly considered removing his catalog. The debate over his legacy, which had never truly been settled since his 2005 acquittal following a 14-week criminal trial, reignited with a ferocity that felt newly urgent and deeply personal. The Jackson estate fought back hard. They sued HBO. They disputed the credibility of the accusers. And they began making strategic moves to reassert control over Michael Jackson's story, his image, his music, his legacy, at a time when the cultural winds felt dangerous. In February of 2022, Lionsgate made an announcement that landed like a thunderclap in the entertainment industry. They were greenlighting a major Michael Jackson biopic. The film would be produced by Graham King, who had guided Bohemian Rhapsody to nearly $1 billion at the box office and 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The screenplay would be written by John Logan, the man whose credits included Gladiator, The Aviator, Skyfall, and Rango, one of the most respected and versatile screenwriters working in Hollywood. And crucially, the film would have the full cooperation of the Michael Jackson estate. That meant access to the music. That meant access to the family. That meant, at least in theory, access to the real story. The announcement generated immediate and intense reactions. Jackson fans were elated. Finally, a major studio with the resources and the catalog rights to do this properly. Critics and journalists who had covered the Leaving Neverland fallout were instantly skeptical, raising questions about whether an estate-controlled production could possibly tell the full story of a man whose legacy was so complicated. Dan Reed, the director of Leaving Neverland, was characteristically blunt. After reading an early draft of the script, he described the project as a, quote, complete whitewash and an out-and-out attempt to completely rewrite the allegations and dismiss them out of hand. Meanwhile, the casting conversation was dominating social media. Who on earth could play Michael Jackson? One of the most instantly recognizable performers in human history, a man whose physicality, voice, and movement were so distinctive that any impersonation risked looking ridiculous. The answer, when it arrived in 2023, was simultaneously obvious and audacious. Jaafar Jackson, the 26-year-old son of Jermaine Jackson, Michael's brother. A young man who had grown up largely out of the public eye, but who possessed, those who knew him said, an uncanny natural resemblance to his uncle, in the way he moved, in the sound of his voice, in the quality of his presence. Casting Jaafar was a stroke of genius, or at least a very clever gamble. It gave the film an authenticity that no outside actor could have provided. It gave the Jackson family a direct stake in the production that went beyond the estate's involvement. This was not just a question of music rights and veto power, but a family of bloodline, of one generation carrying another on its shoulders. And it gave Jaafar Jackson, whose father Jermaine was perhaps the best-known member of the Jackson 5 outside of Michael himself, a moment that was either going to launch a career or be a cautionary tale. The casting received the public backing of Katherine Jackson, the 90-plus-year-old matriarch of the Jackson family. Producer Graham King reportedly visited Katherine at her home and showed her Jaafar in full hair and makeup before filming began. By all accounts, she was moved to tears. Her response, which has since been repeated in virtually every profile of the production, was simple and devastating in its power. That's Michael. Prince Jackson, Michael's eldest son, came aboard as an executive producer and, according to producer Graham King, was on set every single day during production. He was deeply involved in the film's development, offering a perspective that nobody else on the project could provide. But not everyone in the family was on board, and the divisions that emerged would become one of the most talked about subplots of the entire Michael saga. Before we get to that, because what happened behind those closed doors in the production itself is its own jaw-dropping story, let's give some necessary context about who was in front of the camera. Jaafar Jackson trained for this role for years. We are not talking about a few weeks of dance rehearsal and some voice coaching. We are talking about years of immersive preparation, studying archival footage, working with choreographers who had worked with Michael himself, learning to inhabit the specific physical language of a performer who moved unlike any other human being on Earth. Early reports from the set described his transformation as genuinely shocking. Crew members who had known Jaafar before the film said that watching him walk onto the set in full costume was disorienting in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not like watching an impression, like watching a ghost. Colman Domingo, the Oscar-nominated actor who played Michael's father, Joe Jackson, described the experience of working with Jaafar on set as one of the most emotionally intense of his career. Domingo, known for his chameleonic transformations in Euphoria and Zola, committed fully to the role of Joe Jackson, a man whose complicated, often brutal approach to his children's development is credited both with launching one of the greatest musical careers in history and with causing lasting psychological damage. Early reactions from the Berlin premiere described Domingo's performance as monstrous in the best possible sense, a portrayal that made you understand Joe Jackson's contradictions without excusing them. Nia Long played Catherine Jackson. Miles Teller played John Branca, Michael's attorney and co-executor of his estate. Kendrick Sampson played Quincy Jones. Lawrence Tate played Barry Gordy. Laura Harrier played Suzanne DePasse. Kat Graham appeared as Diana Ross. This was a full-scale prestige production with a budget eventually confirmed at $155 million, one of the most expensive biographical dramas ever made. But between the announcement of the project in 2022 and the first day of shooting in January 2024, something extraordinary happened. Something that nobody in the production had seen coming. And it would ultimately reshape the entire film. There is a moment in the making of any film where the dream collides with reality. Sometimes it is a financing problem. Sometimes it is a casting crisis. Sometimes it is a director who cannot get along with the studio. In the case of Michael, the collision happened not during development, not during production, but after principal photography had already wrapped, and it came in the form of a legal discovery so significant that it forced the entire production to tear out its ending and start from scratch. Here is what happened. The film Michael began principal photography in January of 2024 at locations in and around Santa Barbara, California. The production ran for 80 days, wrapping in May of 2024. By all accounts, it was an arduous but ultimately successful shoot. The footage was extraordinary. Jaafar Jackson's performance was extraordinary. Fuqua had found a way to translate the spectacle of Michael Jackson's live performances into cinematic language that felt genuinely immersive. The production had shot roughly 3.5 hours of usable material, with a plan to shape it into a film of more manageable length in the editing room. That original cut had included something that many observers considered essential to any honest portrayal of Michael Jackson's life. A dramatization of the 1993 child molestation allegations made by Jordan Chandler and the subsequent 2005 criminal trial in which Jackson was acquitted of all charges after a 14-week proceeding. The filmmakers had made a deliberate decision to include this material, to portray the allegations and the trial as part of Jackson's story rather than pretending they had never happened. It was a bold choice. It was also, as it would turn out, an inadvertently illegal one. In September 2024, the Financial Times published a report revealing that the Jackson estate had made payments to 5 accusers, people beyond Jordan Chandler, following the release of Leaving Neverland in 2019. That report was significant on its own terms, but it also triggered a detailed review of the estate's existing legal obligations, and that review surfaced something that sent the production into crisis. Buried in the settlement agreement between the Jackson estate and Jordan Chandler, who had received $20 million in 1994, was a clause. A clause stipulating that Chandler's story and his person could never be dramatized in any film, ever, under any circumstances. The filmmakers had violated that clause. Unknowingly, none of them had been made aware of the settlement's specific terms when they were developing the script, but a violation nonetheless. The estate's legal team, which had approved the script, had apparently failed to catch the restriction. According to reporting from Puck and subsequently confirmed by multiple outlets, the filmmakers, including Fuqua, Logan, and King, were not informed of the legally binding agreement until after filming had wrapped. The implications were immediate and catastrophic for the production as it existed. Any scene depicting Jordan Chandler, any scene depicting the events of the 1993 investigation, any scene from the 2005 trial, all of it had to go. The entire third act, which had been structured around this material, had to be scrapped completely. Lionsgate, which had been anticipating a release in April of 2025, pushed the film back to October 2025 within 2 months of the discovery. Then October 2025 came and went, and the film was pushed again, this time to April 24th, 2026, as the production assembled for a 22-day reshoot in Los Angeles in June of 2025. That reshoot cost between $10 and $15 million. The Jackson estate, whose legal oversight had resulted in the problem in the first place, covered the extra costs and received an equity stake in the film in return. The total production budget, which had originally been set at $155 million, grew further with these additions. And then, as if the production had not already weathered enough chaos, another blow arrived. Screenwriter John Logan's house in the Palisades was damaged by the devastating wildfires that struck Los Angeles in early 2025, further complicating the already complex process of rewriting the film's conclusion. The new ending that emerged from the reshoot placed Michael Jackson at the height of the bad era, performing on his world tour, a young man at the absolute peak of his powers, the most famous entertainer on the planet. The film closes with Jackson preparing to take the stage at a massive concert, the crowd noise building, the energy electric. And then, before the credits roll, 3 words appear on screen. The story continues. It was a deliberately optimistic conclusion, a conclusion that honored the music, celebrated the artistry, and left the more complicated chapters of Jackson's story, the allegations, the trials, the final years, the death, for a potential sequel. Industry sources suggest that roughly 30% of the material cut from this version of Michael could theoretically be incorporated into future films, though how any sequel would navigate the legal and ethical complexities of depicting that period of Jackson's life remain deeply unclear. But here's what's important to understand about all of this chaos, all of these delays and reshoots and legal crises. None of it stopped the film from being made. None of it diminished the central performance. None of it, apparently, diminished the appetite of the audience. If anything, the controversy around the production became part of the film's story in the cultural conversation, and that conversation, like all great controversies, drove curiosity, drove attention, drove ticket sales. Because what happened next, the family drama that erupted publicly, the critic-audience war, the streaming numbers that shattered records, surprised even longtime fans of Michael Jackson and longtime observers of Hollywood.